Hey guys, welcome back to another video tutorial where we are looking at the topic of programming using C. In our last video tutorial, we were able to write our first C program where we would have displayed a message on screen so that the user could read and understand what was presented on their computer screen. All right, so for this tutorial we will be displaying a message on screen for the user to be able to read, as well as to allow the user to enter some form of input into the computer that would be stored. All right, so before we proceed to start writing the code, we will just want to get familiar with some of the things that we will be coming across once we start this video in terms of the coding aspect. All right, so on screen we have a table here that is presenting what we refer to as format string and then the meaning. So throughout our input and output functions that we will be writing and performing, there would be some little aspects which we refer to as format string showing up, which would allow for the user to be able to enter their information required, or they enter their data, and then now this would allow the system to be able to convert or transfer this information based on the outline data type. So one of the format string that we will come across is what we see as a %d, and this implies that this allows for the user to input integer data type, right? So this can either be positive or negative whole numbers. So once we're seeing a %d, then we know that this is collecting integer values. If it is that we're seeing a %f, then this automatically implies that we will be collecting from the user some form of decimal number. Can be either positive or negative decimal number. All right, the third format string, %c, this shows up when we're collecting character from the user, and this also will be used interchangeably with the %s and the %s, which is short for string. All right, so we know that character is one value and then string would be multiple characters. So we will also be seeing how we interchange with this information as we go along. All right, so returning to our program, we can now proceed to start writing our program. First line of code, we know that this includes our preprocessor and the headers that we're working with to be able to collect the different functions that we will use throughout our program. So our preprocessor, which is the pound key followed by the word include, and then it tells us what libraries we will be using for this, or headers rather. For this we will be using the standard input output header, and this allows for us to utilize input and output functions. Our next line of code is our int main, and this tells us that following this line is where we would be reading our inputs and outputs, and then the computer would be able to process, accept input, display output, and all that. All right, so we had int main followed by an open and close bracket and then our curly brace. Within this section now is where we would proceed to add in the different aspects of our code. So the instruction again was to display on screen a message to the user, as well as to collect some form of input from the user and then store it in a variable location. So in order for us to collect some form of input from the user and then store it somewhere, we would have to do the declaration of a variable or constant. But for this example, we will be declaring a variable. So let's say we wanted to collect the first name of an individual, and we wanted to store in a variable location called first name. How is it that we declare variables in a C program? We start off by our data type and then the name that we're going to be giving our variable location, and if it is that we are initializing any default value, that would proceed once we declare the name. All right, so in this case we want to declare or collect then first name from the user. Earlier when we were looking at the format string table, I told you that we would be utilizing the character and the string interchangeably. So for C program, what the program acknowledges as a data type is a character, and then the character can be combined with a string, but it does not recognize a data type called string, so the closest to it would be a character. So in this case, we're going to initialize the declare the data type character, and we're using the shortening, which is char, followed by the variable name, and we said that it would be first name. Alright, to proceed to this, currently what this line is saying though, that we're only able to collect one letter from the user. If it is that we're now gonna allow it to become a case where we are able to collect a full name, being able to collect a full name would mean that we are not able to collect a string. So we would have within an enclosed bracket the amount of letters or characters that can make up a first name. So let's say it's gonna amount to maybe 15 letters. So what this is saying, if the person's first name exceeds 15 letters, then we cannot store it. It only goes all the way up to 15. All right, and then from here, this would tell us that we're able to store first name within this location. We are not doing any form of additional assigning default values, so we close off this line with our closing symbol or semicolon. So far, we know that we have a location where whenever we collect the input from the user, it can now go to a location called first name, and this broad location called first name will only store first names, and the first name can only range up to a maximum of 15 characters. Clear so far? Yes, I think we're clear so far. So our next line now would indicate that we are ready to display a message on screen to the user. What is our output function that will allow for this message to be displayed on screen? It was indeed printf, followed by our open bracket, and then within that our double quotation, where we will be including the exact message that the user would see on screen. What's the message? Let's say we want the message to say, please enter your first name here. Alright, so to conclude this line, we will not display anything else other than this message on screen. So we close off this line with our semicolon. Alright, so from here on now, when the user come on screen and they see the message, please enter your first name here, how is it that we will be able to collect now the first name from that user? Again, we have to find input function that will allow the user to provide an input, right? And the input function will be collected from this header. So we're technically trying to find then a function that will allow us to collect from the user a first name. All right, so the keyword that we use with this is referred to as a scanf. So it collects or scans the information that the user enter. Alright, this is followed by an open bracket, and then within the bracket we are gonna have two sections. So I will have a double quotation, that's one section, a comma which separates the second section. How is it that the scanf section works? Again, the message is displayed on screen. So the person comes and they say, please, or see rather, please enter your first name here. The user is now given the opportunity to go ahead and enter their first name. So the first part that would be collected from the user is the format string that we identified earlier. So we're now looking for the letter that represents the data type that we're collecting. And in this case, even though we initialize a data type for character, the amount of characters were 15, so this indicates that it was a string being collected. So in this case, the format string that we are using is in fact the %s. So this allows for us to collect multiple letters from the user. The second part of the code gives us the location now where this string will be pushed to and stored. Where did we declare to store our user's first name? Indeed, it was this heading here, which is first name. So we're gonna put this back, first name. All right, and we are through with this line, so we would close off with our symbol. Before I go ahead and run this code for the purpose of allowing you to see how this function works. Let's just quickly clarify how these lines were again. So printf allows for a message to be displayed on screen. Once the user sees the message, then they know the next step to take. They see the message, enter your first name here. Once they see this, they would then proceed to enter their first name. So the first part of the scanf is where we have the format string, and this is %s because it is a string, multiple characters that we're collecting from the user. So here is where the person would enter their actual name. So let's say the person was Roy. Roy would be allowed to enter their name because of this line of code here. Once Roy has entered his name, then the computer pushes his name to save it into a location which is called first name. So once we go ahead now and look into a location called first name, we can refer to the person who was able to enter their name previously. Is at this point, so I would click to run the program, and then once the program has been debugged and set to run, we see a display message here to please enter your name. So the user would go ahead and enter their first name because this is the only information it is collecting. So let's say his name was Roy. Roy entered his name, and if I select enter on my keyboard, then this would then generate to a line to exit the code. Reason for this, we did not instruct the computer to do any other action. It was only expected to print out a message on screen to tell the user to enter their first name, and then following that, the user would enter their name and the computer would store it. So technically the only two things that the user would be able to do, read the message and then enter their name. All right, so if it is that we wanted the user to see a message displaying to say your name is Roy, then we could proceed to add that message. So in our next line, after we have collected the input from the user and stored it in the location, we could proceed to displaying another message to tell them what the name they entered was. All right, so to be able to display a message on screen, our output function that we use is called printf, followed by a bracket, double quotation, and then within this, what is the message that we want to display. So let's say now, for this, the result that we want to show is your name is Roy. And then outside of this, we want to pull from the location where Roy's name was stored, and it was stored in a location called first name. All right, and then outside of this, we know we close off after the bracket with our closing symbol or semicolon. But before we run this, there might be an error. Let's say the name that was entered was Pam and not Roy. And even if it was Roy's name printed, if another user came, and let's say 1,000 users came, would we be the one to continuously enter their exact name to print on screen where we have here your name is Roy? That would be a very hefty task to do. So instead of putting the actual name here, we could use the format string to represent the location where the user would have actually entered their name. And previously we saw that the format string that we used was %s to collect string data. So instead of putting an actual name here and having to change each time a person enter their name, we could do one global format that works for every single person that comes, and this would be the utilizing of a format string. So to replace the person's name called Roy, we would put % and then the data type, which was a string. So this is saying now, if Bob came to enter his name, the message would say your name is Bob without us having to put Bob's actual name here. If Pam came, it would say your name is Pam. All right, so this second printout on screen indicates that the user get a message inclusive of telling the exact name that was entered, and then the second part indicates the location where that name was stored, which was a variable name. All right, before I also proceed to run this, I can tell that technically both printf messages would be showing in a line, or the results would be in one line. And let's say we want them to be in separate lines, what we could go ahead and do is to include a new line. All right, so to the end of the first sentence within the double quotation, we could include a //n, which represent new line. So this is telling us after you have displayed this message, go ahead and enter a new line to give the result. All right, so let's attempt now to run the program and see what is taking place. All right, so let me scroll down a little bit. So the first line, we're seeing where it says please enter your name here, and that message is being displayed. The second part is now requiring the user to enter their name. So the user went ahead and entered the name. So the person's name is Pat, right? So Pat entered the name, and then once Pat has entered the name and hit enter, the name would then be sent to this location to store in the time being. Moving on to the next part, we also need a message to display to say your name is Pat. All right, so following the storage of her name, we would then receive the message showing the actual name that was entered, which was Pat. So if I click on enter now, I get the message to actually say your name is Pat, and that was technically the only requirement of this program. So automatically the computer would then proceed to exit because there was no other requirement at this time. All right, so I do hope that so far we are able to understand the concept that we have covered thus far, and just please take note where this input section was placed. There is only the word first name. In our next tutorial, there will be a slight change based on our next example that we will be doing, and again you will get the clarification as to why it was done. All right, so for now, this is where we wrap up for this video presentation. Thank you so very much for tuning in, and stay tuned for the others to come.